So, we are discussing a paper by Samo Burja called Great Founder Theory. It's like a sociological study, and this stream is an attempt to give an overview of it and tie it into our current situation, whether broadly societal and also specific to the current states of the dissident rights. And so I don't think we need introductions for now. We could just go on, name each other as it goes. So let's just keep the conversation free flowing. Lunius wanted to ask a very pertinent question. Also, frame this within like a broad summary of the text for viewers who are not familiar.
Yep, I'm Lunius. So, in this book, he speaks about the power dynamic, or the dynamic between the power classes high, low, and middle, and one of them, and he speaks about the conflict between these three classes, and one of the most frequently talked about conflicts, at least on the dissident right, is the high and the low versus the middle, where the highest parts of government ally with the proles against the aristocracy or the well-to-do people who have some influence, and it's quite easy to picture the high-low versus middle conflict as being the conflict which has especially been happening recently within the United States. This work is a very practical work in the sense that the whole piece is very easily applied for those who seek to actually establish some kind of an institution. And one of the or has taken place within this country, the effects of it seem to be the hollowing out of the middle, to where you actually have a depleted middle power class, and where you're left with a majority high and low. And so one of the most useful things that could be taken from this work is that this idea be used as a kind of crystal ball, where if we want to see where this country is heading after this era is over and we go into the next, what other countries have has this with a majority hollowing out of the middle taken place in, and what so was one of the effects of that? That was quite an important thing, I think, that we should take from this book as Americans.
Well, one of the well-studied places where this has taken place before, although I don't know if it's necessarily directly applicable.
Has this with a majority hollowing out the middle taken place
is in Rome,
and so one of the
because you have the division of
that was
the constitutional division of plebs and patricians. So, patrician being the noble families of Rome, and the plebs being basically everyone else. But that leaves a lot of scope for plebs to become very wealthy, and a lot of them did. They could work themselves up to become equestrians, which, as far as I remember, is actually the basis for the later term knight. And that gives you some idea about where the trajectory was actually went, because what ended up happening was that the emperors, as much as they are lauded often, they were the high that were exploiting the low to hollow out what became the new middle. So in the previous iteration of the Roman Republic, the high were the patricians, because there was no authority above them necessarily. But then when it came to the empire, there was the new authority of the imperial office in itself, which thus put the patricians at a lower rung and allowed them to be sidelined and have power taken away from them over time.
That's
So
fine.
I guess that does bring out the interesting caveat that Burja himself mentions in the text, which is that this distinction is very much contingent on the framework that you're looking in. So it may well just be the case that this one middle gets hollowed out, but that a new middle is created in its place, and that
Well,
could either be. Sorry, go on.
It seems like the effect which you were speaking of was the middle was hollowed out in the Roman context, which you were speaking of, and then the previous high became the middle after what was it, a civil war in that instance?
It was a number of civil wars, but effectively, the ascension of Caesar followed by Augustus was the creation of a new high, which superseded the patrician class.
Certainly, yeah. I was just going to say, certainly, a direction that a lot of people have been saying is where we're heading, and where a lot of people are hoping for as well.
Which heading to sort of a Caesar situation?
Of some sorts, yeah.
I have been hearing that actually and thinking it. The
creation of a new high. Historically, this is a thing that has to be done by any monarchical, pardon me, any monarchical, not monarchical, counter-monarchical republican. Any republican institution has to go through an intermediary period of kind of Caesarism, or sometimes in the case of a monarchical. Well, I'll just say my example instead of trying to mince words. In the case of the French Revolution, you have a descent into Caesarism, effectively, where you have a new high and a center, like a pseudo monarch who is very much associating with the low and with the kind of often more liberal elements, if we were to use a modern context, but using the forms, I suppose, of the high in order to the forms of the right and the forms of kind of the monarchy without actually explicitly appealing to the aesthetic of monarchy. And that way you can kind of make it look as though the republic is still intact and kind of appeal to the people who want to preserve the republic because their sensibilities are being sort of nurtured still. Meanwhile, you're training everyone to be more sort of amenable to a republic. And so you get the ascent through the kind of principate, again in Roman terms, which tries to very much talk about things in a republican context and maintain the kind of facade of everything still being a republic in form, even though the realities of the situation are very far from that now. And then you get the ascent up through the dominate, eventually, where you have a kind of god king situation, and the king is actually worshipped. But of course, that takes a very, very long time.
Yeah, this is kind of like a high low versus the middle. In this case, like for example, if this would happen in the contemporary United States, this new high, this like potential Caesar, would have to appeal to the low as I mean, how did Caesar come about? There was a whole bunch of chaos within the Roman Republic, a lot of civil war, a lot of secessionist movements, a lot of rebellions, and I mean, I couldn't imagine that type of strategy working in the United States, for example, without some serious societal, maybe not civil war, but malpractice to the point where people just don't believe the middle, don't believe these like managerial experts, these engineering experts to like get electricity to your house or something, or to get like food to you. In the late stages of the Roman Empire, there was like difficulties getting grain to people, and all these little things start adding up, right? And I mean, I see this today with just like malpractice in in the work environment and just business generally. People are like looking at their phones most of the time. Well, not most of the time, but to a very high percentage of the time that they're working, so they're not being productive. All these little things. So it gets to a point where this new high kind of guy has to appeal to the low in order to get rid of this, like, the middle management of American society that just doesn't work. So this is kind of like this is an appeal to the demos. This looks like republicanism or democracy, but it's really not.
Well, let me add an additional wrinkle then, because one other thing that is quite useful to this analysis that Samo Burja does add is the addition of the outside. So not only do you have the high, low, middle, but you also have the outsiders who don't have any power in the system that you're currently observing, but maybe have power in an alternate or adjacent system. And that was a very significant factor in the Roman example, because what you have is the non-citizen Latins, for example, who launched some of the social wars that did a lot to keep the populares relevant. In the modern day context, we might think of the populares as the liberals or the left, or however you wanted to think about it that way. But they very much appealed to the non-citizen Latins and promised them citizenship and all sorts of goodies in order to acquire their support. But of course, because they don't have that political support which is going to allow a legitimate transfer of power, it means that it's an implicit acceptance of the need for activities and sort of pushes for power that are slightly outside the scope of what is currently acceptable, or, well, in any system is acceptable, really, because it's a reliance on the martial power rather than the political power. So if we were to draw a comparison to modern day America, then you might say, okay, as the illegal class, I suppose, grows, then the illegal immigrant class, then they become a very significant piece in play from the perspective of the outside.
Yeah, definitely. One of the strategies that he explains for the outside, I mean, generally the low is used as instrumental. A very high percentage of them could be thought of as resources. They have no real agency when it comes to centralized decision making, which is the stuff that really affects society. And usually, I mean, it's not just that, but also the middles, right? When the outside comes in, when an outside empire comes in, and empire in this definition, all that means is a centrally coordinated group. I'll bring up the actual definition. It's a very important definition. So let me not mince it.
I was just thinking, though, you kind of to the point that I was just making, you can kind of see that transition already taking place just while you're finding that, because we've even just in the last decade we've seen the Democratic Party move from a party which tries to represent the low to a party which is actually now starting to make significant appeals to the outside. So you're going from appealing to what is commonly termed working class Americans, but still very much within the system, and opposing things like illegal immigration, to tracks, not explicitly saying I'm pro illegal immigration, but kind of giving a wink and a nod by saying we need to crack down on efforts made against illegal immigration. And so that's a very significant transition, I think, for the long-term stability of the United States system.
And in this context, these people making, let's say, the Democratic Party, to be very oversimplistic, these people would be, I mean, some of them are highs. We could even say, so basically, in the distribution of the high, middle, and low, within the high, there's also a high, a middle high, and a low high. And, I mean, I don't think that, let's say, the Democratic Party is in the high. Maybe certain figures, certain leaders of that organization are, like, in the middle high, let's say. But for the most part, that group is the people who decide on the decisions for that institution are in the middle. And a strategy for the outside is to, I mean, usually what happens is that the middle is going to jump ship when they see that their own empire isn't producing anything, and when, isn't giving them more power, let's say. And
the point of Samo's work concerning power itself is more precipice on whether the power is in fact owned or borrowed. So in the sense of the middle and whatever empire it may suggestingly have, it is primarily already borrowed power. So when we talk about borrowed power, it's power that is beholden to a higher actor. In the framework that the middle interacts in this power distribution, it's primarily based upon skill as well as wealth. So the Pareto distribution of skill between the highly skilled and the moderately skilled lays a foundation that unfortunately is unrecognized, but some of us happen to recognize it, to where if you have 90% of a machine, it's not actually functional as 100% of the machine. So you do need to possess the whole machine in order to have real power that can be wielded and also organized. And that is something the middle does not have due to them being beholden.
Yeah, and
I just want to interject really quickly. I think this essay is a very practical, it's a very good practical work in that regard. Like, a lot of the stuff that he says in here, frankly, I take to be common sense, though I may not necessarily have articulated it as well or even at all before I read this. But like that, what he goes on about how the top performers in any field will significantly outperform even those who are just below them, and him visualizing that as controlling like 100% of the machine or 90% of the machine. That's quite useful for anyone who actually seeks to create an institution, because it allows them to better visualize.
He refers to it as the wholeness hypothesis.
Yes.
Isn't that correct?
Or completeness hypothesis.
Okay, completeness hypothesis.
Yeah.
And so that completeness hypothesis is, he uses the example of the car engine, in which 90% of an engine will not run in the sense that 100% of an engine will run. So if an engine doesn't contain 100% of the parts and then properly put together, then it will not operate in the same sense on a ratio basis to 100% of the engine. So the engine, no matter how much gasoline or no matter how much energy that we all pour into the whatever machine that we discuss, there's many ideas on the internet about the idea of the new machine. It doesn't matter how much energy you pour into whatever you think that is, unless it is 100% whole and complete. If it isn't complete, it doesn't matter. Your energy that you put as an input does not get you any type of proportional output.
Yeah, and there are 4 factors that he in a very general sense, right? There. Let me find them. It's feedback. So the 4 important pieces for producing mastery in the domain are good feedback mechanisms, extreme motivation, the right equipment, and sufficient time. And so a very feedback in mechanisms, obviously, to gain more information, and this would further, this is a direct consequence of the completeness hypothesis. If you don't have the complete information, full information is much better than partial information. Extreme motivation, the reason why motivation is very, very important and not just skillfulness, and he makes a distinction between highly motivated, skilled players versus just like skilled players is that, you know, if there's a will, there's a way. If you don't, if you're a really smart guy or a really clever guy, but you don't really want to gain more power, then you're not going to gain more power. You're not going to become the high. You're not going to lead any institution. Right equipment is obvious. Resources are very important. Sufficient time. Time is also a very important resource. So the another explanation is for the power asymmetry between high and middle is relative power in competition. Once again, this is all centered around a framework of competition. What are we competing for? We are competing for power. Is power abundant? No, it's a scarce resource. And so in a competition, whoever is better than the other person is, by like definition, right, going to be on top of them. And bringing us back to the strategy of, for example, middles in our society abandoning our empire, the United States, let's say, or American society, and joining, you know, making appeals to some to some outside force, some outside empire. It's because of these things. It's because they don't really have that much high of a cost in leaving, because all of their power as middles is borrowed. So they just be switching one borrowed power for another borrowed power. And maybe even if they can't figure out how to increase their power, how to gain own power within the system as it is, maybe they're going to be able to find a chance in the new system. So they just have there's very low cost for wanting to leave when the system itself is just not producing anything for them.
Yeah, creating and both the pursuit of own power itself is has a much higher cost analysis. So
Yes.
the stakes are much higher in the realm of dealing with individuals who are on the highly skilled scale. And so what happens is warfare, such as like a nuclear arms race concept, when you're dealing with a much higher skilled like center of people that you are competing with in the arena, those types of the brutality of the fight is going to be it's going to be exponentially higher than someone on the middle who basically will, you know, give tips and give resources and clues to other people in the middle who are trying to go for a job application. So there's this complete difference in power and the importance of that power, because borrowed power is much more it's much more fluid, it's flowing, while the own power is much more stagnant, it's much more solid. It's not something that you want to give away or even give hints at how to attain. It needs to conceal itself, at least the mechanisms in which it gained that solid power. That is the most critical part that must be concealed from a wider audience. And even if the audience was pursuing to find it and searching for it, the majority of people would never find it.
Yeah, and another, like, an incentive for further explaining why why people would want to give out borrowed power instead of own power is because, once again, this is a framework of competition. The borrowed power that you have isn't actually what you could bring to the table in competition with other middles, for example. And those are the people you are. Well, there's a relationship between the high and the middle, in that the middle are, by definition, the people who could challenge the high. Nonetheless, there could still be strategies between middles to try and pull resources together to try and contest the high. Now that is very difficult because it just this stuff just scales, right? Like, let's say if your net worth is $3 million or something, $1 million, you know, that's
It's
risky.
an exponential factor.
Yeah, it's a risky investment.
So,
$1 million. But but
say
to
it
someone,
doubles.
yeah.
Say it doubles every single day. Like every day that 1 million doubles. And so when you start reaching 10 after a week or a couple days, now you're looking at 10 going to 20, 20 going to 40, 40 going to 80. Like you're talking about the risk factor is beyond that which you can hold in. It's not very feasible for someone in a middle ground who lacks the knowledge and information and the skill set to ever be able to effectively wield that type of exponential growth and power. That's the big barrier that has to be overcome.
Another big problem with that is when you try and pull resources together from different players, is that there is an inherent coordination cost. And usually this is very high, and it also operates in like an exponential function. It's a lot, just because coordinating between 3 people and coordinating between 30 people doesn't make it that coordinating with those 30 people is 10 times harder than coordinating with those 3 people. It's like rather it's 300 times harder. I mean, if you look at this from like a network, I mean, what is coordination, right? I mean, coordination is to do something with different parties through communication. Now, if you have 30 people if you're trying to coordinate something within 30 people, that is a social net. There's one relationship between every person to every other person. And maybe there could be, within this coordination, right? You're like coordinating a middle. But you're a middle person and you're trying to coordinate with 30 other middles. But what does that actually mean? That means that you are in a position of high trying to coordinate other people. And so you get this, the scales up to the middle, in this case, it would be like a high middle, a middle, and a low middle. And so you get the same problems, the same dynamics occur. This doesn't really happen if you are the high of an already established empire, because you already have a lot of own power. You could just risk it. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one thing that could be really easy to get from all that's been said thus far is that the picture for the middle, like if you're a middle player, and you don't have a high, which is something that you can enter into or something that can actively yield returns for you cooperating with them. The picture for the middle is quite bleak and quite difficult at times, more so than the low or the high, because the high is in control of things and the low has really nothing to lose, whereas the middle doesn't have anything to lose in a sense that it doesn't really have the it's not the high, so it doesn't have its power center necessarily to lose. I think one, I guess, something that any listener might infer is that it's very profitable to become so say you're a foreign entity entering into a new country, it is very profitable to replace the middle. If you have England, for example, and you're part of the Somalis entering in, and you end up somehow replacing the English middle class with a Somali middle class, not only do you have the borrowed power from the English, but you have your home country. I think Somalia was a poor example there. Let's say just any other country. You get what I mean. But it can be quite the middleman can be simultaneously the hardest stepped on of any of the other power classes, and also the most dangerous if the middle manages to coordinate with an outside power. But at the same time, the risk is very high for something like that, because treason is punishable by death, as Burja says.
Well, there's an interesting wrinkle there, because I think the high actually have it worse, to be honest, because except that they have more options to be able to work their way out of their situation because they are often the context-setting party. But the
Perhaps.
middle is quite dangerous to the high, because not only can the high lose power to each other, but the high can also be replaced by the middle, or just generally lose some amount of power to the middle. Whereas the middle,
Julius Caesar situation, basically.
well, yeah, sort of. Or you could just look
Caesar
at the.
was definitely a middle from his background.
So he was a relative of oh god, what is his name? Marius.
Yes, he did have connections, I won't lie.
And he had a very significant name as well. One of the really old dynasties of Rome was.
Mm-hmm.
He was a product of that, the Julii. But yeah,
He could be like a low high, right?
The point,
Yeah, you can think about it.
the point in Samo's writing concerning Julius Caesar was basically that distinction mechanism between the ambitious, moderate, skilled people and the ambitious, yeah. And many times, I guess we could say low, high.
Oh, you're cutting out. You're cutting out a bit. Sorry.
Maybe the top party. Those tend to be the
Nero,
moderate.
I can't hear you. Sorry, man. You've been cutting.
Can you
out.
hear me talking now?
Okay, now it's good. Now it's good. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, I was just simply pointing out how Burja's work was trying to make a distinction between the ambitious, moderately skilled and the ambitious yet highly skilled. So individuals like Julius Caesar were given the example as being the ambitious and highly skilled, in the sense that maybe on the distribution of the Pareto distribution, he would be at the top for what he was able to recognize in a social context, regardless of what part of the high, middle, or low that we look at from generative anthropology. We can still realize that there is this fundamental distinction between skills, relationships, and also power acquisition that exists regardless of which part of the spectrum that you're operating in. So the ambitious and the moderately skilled, they will flock to areas where resources are highly concentrated. And these people tend to flock towards the dense locations where they enter into a few domains of competition. And those examples that we know of, at least in the United States, can be found. These people can be found pursuing finance in New York, and technology in Silicon Valley, as well as politics in Washington, D.C. So these ambitious yet moderately skilled people, they are looking for power and where it is understood and where it is known, where there is prestige. It's some sense a type of common knowledge that these are centers of power that they have the ability to enter into. But the ambitious, highly skilled person who is looking for own power and not for power, the people.
You're cutting out again a lot. I can't hear you right now.
Sorry, those people with the ambitious, high skilled, those people on the graph of the Pareto distribution, they congregate in the unoccupied areas that offer that own power. And so we see this with like entrepreneurs who go to start businesses and found new things that will give them large amounts of own power, yet these are in obscure areas that are difficult to find. They're not in established, prestigious areas that are well known.
I think a good practical example of that, relevant to me, is this is going to sound silly, but trailer production. So, like, the trailers that you see on the backs of like pickup trucks that farmers use and other such things. So there are only, in my area, there's one company that's basically managed to establish a local monopoly on this business. And So I don't know anything about the founder of that company, or the company itself, but I do know that that a local monopoly has been established on trailers, and that's something to say in itself, and probably a good example of going to an area that no one knows about and managing to find pretty much create owned power, or something much closer to owned power than, say, going to Silicon Valley for tech.
Yeah. So I
Well, even in that context, it is quite interesting how so much of Silicon Valley is made up of startups, and that is in itself an attempt at creating owned power rather than just working for Google or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, but I would say though that another one of the four factors of that those four big factors: the feedback mechanism, the extreme motivation. The two last ones are resource and time. And so even if you are establishing, even if you are an entrepreneur, if you're going at it in an extremely saturated market, you're just not going to. There's going to be a lot of lack of resources. In this case, like customers, right? So prime. So basically, what you want. It's not just own power, but it's also like prime real estate, right? You need to get the untapped market.
He also emphasizes the wholeness concept, where you can't just simply have say a lot of money. You also have to have the social connections and the skills to actually organize and utilize that money, or otherwise it's quite pointless. You have to be able to defend the resources that you have. Like an X amount of resources with someone who can defend them is not the same as someone with X amount of resources with someone who cannot defend them. And those X's are the exact same quantitatively, yet they are different qualitatively.
Yeah, and defensibility of power really is, it seems to me to be the necessary quality of own power, right? It's all about defending it. If you can't defend it, then it's not. It's all borrowed power, basically. Like you are at the mercy, of, let's say, of the U.S. government to like run a business or something, unless you could start.
And it's not just the government. I mean, this can be any scenario.
Mm-hmm.
You're at the mercy. You are beholden to somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to, I guess, just at the really meta level, if that's the appropriate term, trade itself, the necessity for like specialization in order to, because once again, resources are a key. Resources and time are a key, a key factor to gaining more power, and specialization in trade are one of those ways to like really efficiently gain those things. As long as that's like a inherent, that's like a necessary aspect of being competitive, then literally all power in the ultimate frame of things is borrowed.
Well, also in the context of something that I said just before we started the stream, if you scale up to the very highest level, then because as Burja says, this analysis is relevant in relation to what you're observing. So if you go all the way up to the highest level, then even something which everyone would think is owned power in the purest sense of the word, so perhaps, I don't know, like owning a building, perhaps that is still contingent on the government's willingness to back up your claim to the land.
Yeah.
So at the end, you're always contingent on, or you're always reliant on government backing up your claims to more or less anything. So all of that power is borrowed from the government in a certain sense.
Yeah, the what Samo also refers is that the best places for people to gain that type of own power, to where then you would be able to defend it, because that's a necessity for it to be owned power. You have to be able to defend it. he states that they are the undiscovered realms. And eventually, what will happen is those old power centers, they may stay around and they will become more known over time as being competitive. Will dry up because now you have a larger amount of people who have now entered into that space, and there's less room now in that space for someone else to enter in. So your goal is to understand where those existing spaces are, where there is prestige and known power, visible power, and then to make the calculation, the risk of whether entering into that sphere is worth your time, or whether you want to look for new spheres of influence to either create, seed, or to enter into that are more long-term growth oriented.
And the sphere aspect of this is very important. We have to keep in mind that there are multiple domains. Earlier we were talking about, the strategy of the broadly American societal middle allying with outsiders, and the broad societal high allying with the low. This is assuming one domain. That's not the case. There are multiple domains. There are one of the things that he says, the term that he uses is that power is fractal. Yes. Fractal.
Yes.
And so for us moving forward, for example, this isn't like I guess it's not that dismal, because there are multiple domains that we can establish ourselves as the high, even though, let's say, geopolitically, if that is a domain, we wouldn't be high. You could, we're also, let's not abstract this stuff too much. We're like talking about literal human beings who live in like time and space and stuff. And if you could organize them, like actual physical organization, that's all going to be in like regional areas, right? This is all going to be throughout geography. And there's definitely a lot of geography in the United States, for example. Not too hot on Britain, but
yes, whatever type of institution that you would establish, this is also covered in the beginning of Samo's book. Those types of institutions that will be created, in the sense that they will then have that own power and the ability to wield and defend it depends on a variety of factors to make it qualified to be that type of institution. And those institutions have varieties of technology, some being referred to as social technology. And so in social technology, we create like operation protocols, such as web development, politeness, and the operating protocol for like social interaction. So any type of common things that you do, like say hello, wave, those types of social interactions have to be developed for that institution to be functional. So this is like getting on an even more meta level that Samo goes into. And then on the individual level, those individuals to operate in that environment, the social technology allows that to occur. So you are going to need some type of priestly institution to institute a direct, like a modus for that type of institution to operate. Otherwise, it's not effective. It has no efficiency. It basically lacks operation procedure.
And yeah. No, go ahead, finish.
He goes a bit more into other things that have to be developed as well, which includes, we all know, strategy itself, that can outcompete other institutions, and then other ideas that we commonly refer to as political theory and government. So you have to have a governmental laws, ideologies, social norms, education, and credentialism. So all of those are like foundations that are used by existing institutions as basically functions to ensure their operation ability.
Well, even with operations, provided that an institution is still functioning, it made. I think we should also relate this this to the concept of live and dead players. just because an institution is functioning, and going along its typical procedures, doesn't necessarily mean that it's an active or that it's a live player that's able to do things that it hasn't done before, as the definition says.
Yes.
And one thing I think that is very, very practical to the right. And by the way, before I go on, I think the chapter on the traditions of knowledge, it seems almost out of place, but I'm really glad that it's in there. But anyway, for the right, one thing that is rather lacking, for a lot of different groups within the dissident right, is at least one theorist, as he says. You have certain circles which do have a living theorist who is, like Dugan with the Nosballs, Adam Katz, and etc. for GA Gang. But a lot of at the same time, a lot of right wing strategy is just trying to do what has been written down, and acting in a sort of dead manner, which I think is especially detrimental within the United States, rather unprecedented playing field.
There are completely new ideas and strategies that exist that have been theorized and are currently in the books, and some of them have been practiced in other places in the world throughout history. Yet, unfortunately, the primary groups of people, even in these particular fields, have not shown a willingness really to implement new strategic ideas. They're very caught up in one particular way of looking at solving these issues, or creating own power, which I think is really all they want at the end of the day. If they can't verbalize what it is that they want, I would say that they want own power. I think that is what they desire fundamentally.
And whenever you said that, I think the thought popped into my head. You said that fundamentally all they want is own power, but in terms of like an ideological movement, I think that if all that you really want in the end is own power, and your ideology is just a facade for you to get that, or it's just a kind of unconscious means to that end, you'll never actually get own power. If you can't do something outside of this system which fails to yield own power, you're not going to escape it. You're not going to get what you want. And it's going to be the people who do manage to figure out some way to address the problems that are present within the United States.
Own power comes first. Ideology implementation comes second.
Yeah, and by necessity, if we remain dead players, we aren't going to get to these secrets, these secret domains that he's talking about. That the places that you could get a lot of power but isn't obvious. If we're completely dead, we're never going to go into these fruitful domains, right? These untapped markets, so to speak.
Well, until a theorist comes along, perhaps.
And that would be the role of the priest, which is very important.
To revive the tradition of knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah, a tradition of knowledge is important, and then having a mechanism in which that tradition of knowledge is inherited, like direct, like the Greeks operated under like a very direct way of teaching between a master and a pedagogue.
Yeah.
That is one of the things that he references.
And I guess...
Go ahead,
Nero.
If you have a theorizer, that's great, but you also have to have some type of institution for that theory to then be actually used. So you have to build an institution, and you have to have a theorist. Like, those two are inseparable. They have to.
Sure, but we already have a kind of soft institution. We already have an understanding of relationship to one another, even if you or I individually don't necessarily know every single right winger out there. We have an understanding of if we're going to use a kind of Schmittian perspective, we have a reasonable idea about who our friends and who our enemies are.
but we need. I think we need just more coordination. I think we're lacking a lot. I guess this is. I'm coming from the narrative that David Hines basically comes up with in his blogs analyzing how the leftists did this. His idea, and I think this is completely true, is that at least in the American right, you're never going to see, for example, some advertisement about lower taxes or like anti-gun control advertisement in like a pro-life march or something like that. And obviously these are like mainstream conservative things I'm talking about. This is especially true for. Well, maybe it's not so super true for the dissident right. I think the dissident right does have other problems. I do think that there's a lot more networking going on, but just historically, whether moderate or radical rights, there's really not too much coordination happening in the United States. At the very least, the most coordinated effort that the right has are the gun groups. And we're because of the nature of gun laws, it's all done at the state level. So you have to have like constant local political activism in actual activism.
It's institutionalized.
Well, that's what.
Because that's the only way that it can actually occur in a defense mechanism. The right wing
not only that, but it
doesn't want. Most people do not want an institution. That's the major issue. Because if there's an institution, then they have to actually fall in line when there's a problem and they realize that, hey, maybe they're wrong. There's just a lot of people who, unfortunately, would prefer to be lone wolves and think that they can accomplish something on their own, but they can't.
I'm actually going to take a very different perspective on that, because going at it from that kind of structured perspective, I mean, especially coming from the perspective, as you said, of the left having done this and followed this same recipe to get where they are today, that would be the route that they would be most careful to ensure nobody else follows, surely. And so
Yes.
the fact that the one domain in which you can use this same strategy is in the pro-gun movement, to me that just screams like a situation of legality. They can't crack down on you on that one issue because the courts could nail them for it.
Well, I mean, just on the level of, I think, right, from general activism, there's not really cooperation between the different interest groups, I guess you could say, of the right wing, whereas that's completely the opposite in the left wing. For example, the black activist groups, the Antifa anarchist groups, like even Bernie supporters.
Yeah, but they're operating with the tacit approval or even explicit approval of the high.
Yeah, I think in the right wing as well, there are legitimates that people have that are fundamental disagreements, which are of the degree of importance to where it would keep people from actively or cooperatively.
I mean, my solution to
No, there's way more on the left.
really
What else does the LGBT movement and it's the common example, but the LGBT movement and the Islamist movement have in common other than voting left?
I've never considered the Islamist movement to be considered like a formal left.
Well, no, it isn't. It isn't by any objective metric.
They're an outside.
But based on how they vote and how their loyalties lie.
Yeah, they just
Where their loyalties lie.
utilize the other groups in the left more as like a.
Sorry if you're talking. I don't know if you're talking or not.
I said between the left-wing movements and the Islamists, it's both groups see each other in the proxy form.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you could, you live in the UK, so you tell me this. Is there actual political activist coordination between Muslims and let's say SJW types in the same way that there's active political coordination between black activists and gay rights organizations and Antifa in the United States? Or is this only through voting?
I'm not directly I'm not directly involved enough to know particularly, but I would definitely say that there is cooperation to the extent that, for example, people in the kind of lefty deep state establishment, I guess you could say, will cover for what Islamists are doing. There was a recent example of that with a group that was counter-protesting a Tommy Robinson political event when he was running for office, and they were effectively allowed to attack a crowd of completely unarmed people, women and children who were doing nothing but have conversation, have a little normal political rally, because the right target was being attacked.
Yeah.
You can see that in the grooming gang thing as well, where they were covered for basically. God, what else?
I do get the point. I mean, that's a very providing cover.
And there's also the whole Islamophobia thing. I mean, that's more of an international phenomenon, but
yeah, I mean that's like a zeitgeist level. That's like a social technology type of thing, right?
Yeah, but it's a very deliberate.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. I just when it comes, I guess, to
Muslim Brotherhood.
Oh, sorry.
Whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Whatever it's called. And I have a very hard time thinking that anybody in the media, particularly, doesn't know that. Anybody who's making that call at that kind of high level has to realize where that word actually comes from and where the idea actually comes from.
Well, I guess this might be like an extremely abstract question, but from what I see, it's that's like a social technology. That's like a strategy using social technology, and the way I see social technology being the most effective is through reducing coordination costs for like a positive movement, rather than I don't think that I don't really see social technology being that effective when you're using it to like counter a player, for example, like using it as like an offensive strategy. I can only see it as like a defensive strategy, right? Like a facilitator to your own actions, rather than. I mean, this is extremely abstract thing. I don't even think maybe this just doesn't matter at all what I'm saying. Like, I don't know, Islamophobia, right? Islamophobia is like this like meme generated throughout society. This would be like a proper social technology. What Islamophobia does is it doesn't like it gives cover for the Muslims. Let's say it doesn't actively hamper the right wing. It does it like indirectly. You would need to follow that up with like enforcement. It existing on its own doesn't really do anything, and that's why I would say the Muslims are kind of an outside, because they themselves are operating under like completely borrowed power. There is no active coordination in like political activism. It's like a one-sided relationship. It's not one side. Obviously, the Muslims are giving them votes, but when I mean community-based activism, right? And I think that's the only, and why I think this is important is because I that's the only viable solution for the right wing, for example. Party politics, I don't think is going to work. I don't think we're going to really influence anything through voting. And I'm trying to look at the deficiencies of the right wing from that we don't actually like coordinate anything. And I do think that like political activism in that sense is in the non-electoral sense is does do stuff. I mean, I don't know if I'm rambling. Sorry.
Well, and on that, I think that's a great way to actually talk about the great man himself. So we have, in the United States.
Well, actually, sorry. Before we do move on, there is one thing that I would like to add as an addendum to that: is that I don't think it's worth modeling Muslims as a unified group, because there's obviously the outside Muslims who provide significant backing through money in some cases, providing some ideas, some social technologies. If we're going to say that Islamophobia is a social technology, not sure that I agree, but let's stick with it for now. And then you've got the inside Muslims, who are more like a low, because they are already within the system. They have a certain amount of political power. They have some of their own organizational capacity in a political sense. So yeah, I think it's worth modeling those two groups separately.
Fair enough.
But anyway, yeah.
So,
what were you saying? Sorry.
Well, with what Suda was saying on the matter of the lack of coordination within the dissident right, especially within the United States, a lot of this, and this depends on how the movement actually goes, but what Burja has to say on the great founder himself as a character, the header on page 65, bottom of the page reads, "A great man is someone with a secret and a plan," which, and I wrote in my notes on this that it seems like what Burja is speaking about in terms of the great founder is that he's a man who, or rather that the process to becoming a great founder involves a kind of functional esotericism, not necessarily, or in the sense that those who can, grasp the reality of power and know, how to say organize the dissident right in any direction. If it was clear to all of us, I imagine things would have happened at this point. There must be a way, because people are going in that direction of, yes, there is something that we can do in the real world and it can actually have an impact, but seemingly yet no one has actually tapped into that. And so there's almost an esoteric nature to power that those that you find, that you almost randomly find where power is, what you do with it. And of course, it's going to be tied to the abilities of this person and such. But I just thought that was my takeaway on page 65 and 66. That power is almost esoteric.
Yeah, there's a little funny little quote that goes along the lines in David Hines' blog, where power looks like a magic trick for those who don't have it, and mechanistic for those who use it often. Something along those lines. Okay.
Right.
In that case, anything else on that matter? Anything that we could connect to it to moving forward? If not, then we could go through another section and start a new line of conversation.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add.
I just wanted to mention the signs of the traditions of knowledge. So for any type of power that establishes itself in the sense of an institution, there are this list that Samo has mapped out. And for me, it is on page 12 of the book. And in this list, he lists out that there is roughly an order from best to worst, the indicators of a living tradition. And so in the production of the notable effect, the powerful generals and well-balanced swords, it is possible for a notable effect to be produced without understanding, for example, by following a set of instructions. In practice, though, the productions of notable effects require the actual understanding because effective action is too complex to be captured in instructions. So his first main point is that an institution that can wield power and does so effectively has the ability to create and to utilize inherited to create either machinery or create Sorry, what? Yeah, there's a notable effect that requires that understanding that has to be beyond instructions. It can't just be an instruction manual. It has to be truly understood. As an instance, as he gave the example of creating well-balanced swords for a blacksmith.
Yeah, you have to produce like actual results in order to gauge whether or not the tradition is live. As one of the marks, yeah. And I guess do you want to talk about, because I really do think that this ties in nicely to the discussion we were having about the distant right, because he talks about one of the good markers of a live tradition of knowledge is that there are master apprentice relationships within the organization, because the masters can really assess whether or not if they have like an implicit understanding of it, if they can produce good swords, etc. It's like a really good vetting system, right? And I think we need that, and I think we need more of that.
Well, that's kind of like a proof of the pudding is in the eating kind of situation, and we don't really have a good mechanism for that because, well, we're being kept out of power. If I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah. But we do need to move forward from some position, right? I mean.
Well, okay, no, actually, that brings us back around to another point about fractal empires, because one of the things that we can be doing is that creating not mock empires per se, because empire means different things to most people than it does in this context, but in the sense of creating our own little sort of institutions and internal empires, which can then be scaled up in some sense, or at least that we're getting practice for what later might be control of a slightly different or slightly larger, slightly more significant empire.
Yeah, so I guess I never did give the definition of the empire, so we'll just give it here. Here we use empire to mean a group of coordinated actors that operate around some central power. Coordinated actors are those people using discernible mechanisms for aligning their actions to achieve particular goals. A central power is an actor or set of actors causing others in a given region to coordinate. The actual power center may not be the ostensible power center. For example, a startup might be de facto run by its CTO rather than its CEO. An empire, then, being a group of coordinated actors, will, among those actors, always have some kind of central power that is maintaining coordination. And, that's what we would have to. We would have to create some kind of coordinating mechanisms. We would have to create. We have to prop up leaders. That's definitely a really big thing, and I don't think that YouTubers aren't really leaders. They would be like, if anything, theory. What's the word, right?
Theorists.
Yeah, theorists. So and I guess that this is a goal of the behemoth of our little communities, to try to give people practical skills for becoming like a leader, like practical management skills. The elective courses I've taken in university have all been in management. People really need these practical skills. Go
ahead. Basically, I'll offer like a 5-point solution concept. So basically, I like what it's Marcher, right? Is that how I pronounce it? All right. He just basically referenced what I would call the proto-evangelium. And so the proto-evangelium is basically the preeminence of the kingdom is basically a type of practice. So in that practice context, you yeah, it's a type of practice in the sense that it's on a smaller scale already. You can have defined goals that are real goals that you do want to achieve, but consider it as a practice, as a preliminary, and utilize and then build upon them. You want to create a precipice and then also have a feedback loop for people to not only improve, but to have some type of honors, because honor fuels achievement, as Samo says in a different article of his. So in that 5-point solution, you want to have a system of giving honor. You want to have credentialism, so you want to offer people some type of credential, which then the third part is some type of educational feedback loop. And then fourth would be a place for people to use those skills. And then the fifth part would be a team that where do we want to use these skills in application for getting a certain goal. Those are your five parts. And that's your practice. That's your proto-evangelium to the kingdom.
Yeah, no argument. That all sounds pretty reasonable. The only thing I would caution about, though, is I'm not sure. So one thing I disagree with Burja about is the implication. Well, does he actually say this? Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. I don't remember. But the implication that all empires are created equal, I'm not so sure about that. So I think that.
No, he doesn't. I don't think he's ever stated that.
No. But what I mean is that I think there's a fundamentally different character to something. To, let's say, a sovereign empire and a non-sovereign empire, or an empire that is designed to serve under the sovereignty of a different group. So, and I think you can see this quite clearly when you look at organized crime groups versus government, because they look quite similar compared to business and let's say business and government, and they look a bit more distinct from one another in how they act, because one of those categories is operating under the assumption of kind of in the end no holds barred when it comes to competition, and the other is very, very much existing in a limited capacity.
I think he does state something.
If you're talking, we can't hear you right now. Nero. Yeah, we can't. Sorry. You have to restart from the top.
It says something along the lines of how there's differentiation between power, depending upon like context. So it could be an empire; they could both be empires, but they operate.
I think you're like me again.
Yeah, Nero, you cut out again. Sorry, man. They operate. No, we can't hear you. No, sorry, man. Try joining back in and out. Like, leave the voice chat. Can you hear us? Yeah. Maybe he can't even hear us.
Well, okay. In the meantime, does anybody else have any particular thoughts on that? On what I stated about differentiation between different empires, empire types?
I mean, I do think he does talk about this isn't explicitly in the context that you're saying it, but it could be easily translated. The idea of limited and unlimited actions. I think it's actions.
Oh yes, he does. He does discuss it in that different capacity. But the way that he was talking about, fractal empires, kind of to me implied that there's a kind of universal model of empire, and I'm not entirely sure that's the case, or at least that it would need a little bit of tweaking to combine those two concepts, which are admittedly in the same book, of limited versus unlimited competition. But I think that fundamentally shifts the nature and design of the empire and how it thinks to act. So, for example, I don't think you could just put a business in charge of a country and expect it to function in the same kind of way that you'd expect a gang in charge of a country, say.
Absolutely. I was thinking, like what y'all were saying on the limited versus unlimited empires being if how they look determines how they behave, then yes, it will be probably at least either substantially or rather different on what it's capable of doing, or even just fundamentally different. I have in mind the painting that Evola paints of this of the primal or the golden age king, of how they would remove as many obstacles to power as possible, because this man will be so great a king that you want to they'd want him to be able to do as much as possible
Unheeded.
with that, yeah, unheeded.
Or unimpeded.
And you contrast that with like any kind of a constitutional monarchy. You have the middle in the, I guess, the Evolish kingdom would be would act a whole lot differently than the middle in a constitutional monarchy, even if both are in some sense aristocrats. In the sense that the middle would mostly in the sense that the middle can act more as the instrument of the high, rather than as being the check of the high.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I wanted to do with this is paint a picture of what a healthy, what a live, effective dissident right would look like according to Burja. I think that's a good painting to paint here. Does anyone have any first shots they want to take at that?
You raised the.
Yeah,
If you've got some thoughts already, then yeah,
All right.
you go ahead.
So, I mean, I think, the dissident right is something that is, it's so broad of a tent. You have such a wide array of ideologies that some kind of a writer who can, in the context of the United States, can kind of encapsulate the common ground shared between all groups that fall under this title. That such a theorist would certainly be one who that would certainly be the theorist, which would create a live tradition of knowledge. And I think that the writer who would be able to do such a thing would perhaps write on the subject of power dynamics, kind of de Juvenalian power analysis, he would basically take the concept of high, low versus middle, these power classes, and just expand on it in the same way that Burja did, or other such things. That would certainly be one way which I think that we could have such a theorist, and at the same time, once you find the theorist, I don't think that if we do obtain a theorist who is able to reach all groups within the dissident right, the great founder might either be the writer himself, or someone who manages to utilize these writings. I don't think that the mobilization of the dissident right can happen unless you manage to find someone who is able to reach all parties.
Yeah, you're going to need a theorist, but you're also going to need a managerial class. You're going to need a type of aristocrats.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
So that type of there will be some type of basically it will be a mechanism where you have it's like a dyad where you have the managerial class and then it orbits around the actual like the someone who we would say is the theorist. And so the theorist is like a spiritual concept, and then the managerial class is the body for it in which to give it life.
Right, and that could be formed. That's something that can be formed. Sudo and I have been reading that David Hyde's article in the Radical Book Clubs. If I mean, certainly, you know, um, book club leaders are not necessarily the best movement leaders or anything like that, right? Certainly good at reading books, probably, but even having something like that, if something as simple as that, if something like that were to form, that would kind of be a bureaucracy open to be conquered by a good leader who's fit to assume the position that's being prepared by all these people who are basically waiting for someone like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I do really like, I guess in this case, the theory, right, that you were, I think from what I got what you're saying, a theory you would like to see looked at is like social science in general. And that would directly help with the building up of like a distant right managerial class or something like that, quasi management, like community organizer class, we could say. If Nero has to step out, then just go ahead and take the floor before you leave.
Yeah, just creating a managerial class and some sense of basically you want to have a doctrine of rationality, where the rationality doctrine would basically point out certain ideas that we might find in like the broader right wing, and then we want to make a list of those and take those ideas and then basically be able to explain each of the concepts in like a greater social setting of, for instance, like you could have this thing that you want, but should it be explicit or implicit? And then how do you go about achieving that within the context that you live in? And so those types of that list of things can then be understood implicitly or explicitly based on its relative factors. So that would be I think that's going to be a precipice for any type of unification or basically just simply working together towards any type of common goals that are actually achievable and finite. I mean, eventually you will have to develop a hierarchy that basically tells you like this is okay, this is not okay.
Definitely.
But that's if you actually want power. If you do want power, unfortunately, you're going to have to, you have to sacrifice something into, whatever this is, like a pot per se. You have to give up. I mean, whether we like Adam Smith or not, or some of these other groups of people in the liberal movements, I think that to some extent they might have a truth to it, that you do have to sacrifice some part of your own agency in order to participate in something greater that might give you more agency in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's sacrificing your agency for borrowed power, and borrowed power ultimately could translate to own the power through like gaining of contacts, gaining of skills, gaining of knowledge, and all this stuff. And hopefully, in the end, we could. I mean, I think that the model that we should be striving for is a more decentralized model, especially when as Nero was pointing out, there's a lot of disagreements within the right. Well, Cavalier thinks that there's a lot of disagreements within the left as well. But let's say there's a lot of disagreements within both, right? And I think that the way that we need to do it, and the way that the left has also done it to a certain degree, is to decentralize it, and to give to go. It's like go through a centralized vetting process. We could say, let's say that, and then to put people in a position where they now have skills, where they now have context, and to give them personal responsibility for personal projects that they want to implement in whatever direction they want, given under the assumption that there's like an alliance, there is cordial interaction, there is sympathy between the different groups, even if we are like ultimately like the right wing is like segregated between itself. Like I'm thinking of like competing right wing groups. Like it's a not competing in that sense, but it's like different right wing groups trying to gain power ultimately in different directions, but under this assumption of alliance. And I don't know if this is like a pipe dream or whatever, if we're going to end up just stabbing each other in the back. But I mean, I think that this is the move I would bet on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, it depends. So on the stabbing in the back element, that really depends on who's actually getting the power in the end, because there are groups which have done more of that, and there are groups which have done less upon gaining power.
Yes, historically, definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also the element of centralization when you get to the as an end rather than a means, because one of the attractions of decentralization is that you do allow scope for different more regional power centers to necessarily fighting a zero-sum or fighting in a zero-sum game. Yeah, where only one person gets power at the end, or one group gets power at the end at the expense of all others. If you follow.
Yeah, and I guess on a very broad note, and we're not going any specifics on this, but one of the different factors that limits people's power is personal incentives. I'm pretty sure. Where is it? Personal incentives. Yeah, I mean, I guess a way that we could... There's two ways of protecting against that. That would be trying to create some kind of social technology. I mean, so this isn't really possible if we're thinking about it in like the right wing is going to be segregated between religious faiths or something. You're going to have Protestants, different sects of Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, seculars, neo-pagans if they become a prominent force. We're not really going to have that. That's going to be a very big difficulty if we can't coordinate under like the same implied code of ethics. Though there's definitely, obviously, at least within the Christian sects, there's like obvious overlap. And the other solution to that is personal incentives. They have to participate. I mean, we would have to create some kind of centralized institution or something like that to say that what Nero was talking about, credentials, right? We would have to try and create our own credentials and get people, get future leaders through the credential system, and just like maybe even in more physical aspect, like being in the same community, right? I've been toying with the idea of like in the future, obviously not now, but like mass migration to a certain part of the country, like the Mormons did in Utah. And that could, I mean, that's like an obvious political, an obvious personal incentive if you have to live in this in a community with other people. Though if we're segregating the communities, this muddies the water as well.
True.
So, any final words before we go?
I have none.
I think I pretty much said everything, to be honest.
No, this is good. So, moving forward, whether or not we do another stream on Borja, because we did not get to the end of his paper, it does have a lot of interesting stuff there as well, on bureaucracy. But whether or not we do another stream, we'll have to see in 2 weeks' time. But thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Nero for coming. You're not here anymore, but really appreciate your contribution. Really appreciate everyone's contribution. If you want to join our reading group, if you want to know reactionary apologetics or like stuff on management, stuff on systems theory, stuff on like this type of practical politics level of stuff, then for sure join the link in the description. And there's also a link to Cavalier's YouTube channel and his blog site where he writes poems.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, and have a nice day, everyone. Keep clean.